You want to know why Malcolm X was so connected to Africa? Because his own mother was actually raised by Africans. So this is how the story goes.
Land is the basis of all independence.
Chicky, 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 chicky. How you doing? Talking about Malcolm X's connection to Africa.
We are African, and we happen to be in America. We're not American. We are people who formerly were Africans who were kidnapped and brought to America.
One of the things that I learned through reading, through some information, actually my mom gave me this information because my mom is from Grenada. The same place where Malcolm X's mother, Louise Little, comes from. She comes from Grenada. She was actually born in 1897, and as Malcolm X had explained in his autobiography, and as it's pretty well known to anybody who knows anything about Malcolm X, is that his mother is a mulatto, or half black, half white. You're not allowed to use the word mulatto anymore. But his mother is half black, half white, and his grandmother was raped by a white man, and that's why Malcolm X has the the reddish colored hair and the light colored eyes and the light skin, is because of that white blood that he has running through his veins. But the interesting thing about this is what makes Malcolm X so connected to Africa.
New bridges must be built, because in the minds of the majority of our people today, Africa is too far away. So the only way you and I can point them in that direction is build new bridges. We have to have the type of understanding of Africa and the type of understanding of our people here in order to build a bridge, a contact, a line of communication between the two. And once the lines of communication have been established, and our African brothers can stretch forth their hands and reach us, and we can stretch forth our hands and reach them, why, there's nothing that this blue-eyed man in this country will be able to do to you and me successfully from that day onward.
What makes him so connected to Africa? Now, we know that Malcolm X's parents were Garveyites, right? Marcus Garvey, the great Pan-Africanist, black nationalist, who had the slogans all about embracing black beauty, embracing Africa, black people going back to Africa, these kinds of things. Malcolm X's parents belonged to the UNIA, all right, the Universal Negro Improvement Association, all right. They were coming up at a time where a lot of black people, not only in this country but all over the world, were members of the UNIA, and so we know that's a given. Malcolm X is going to be raised in a household where he hears that kind of conversation. But now the question becomes, what drove one of Malcolm's parents, Malcolm X's mother, to become so interested in this Back to Africa movement? Now, the thing that's interesting about Louise Little is that she was born in Grenada in 1897, but Malcolm X's grandmother, right, Louise Little's mother, was actually 100% pure-blooded African from Nigeria. Now, how do we know this? Well, apparently there have been some people that have been doing some research. I think this one historian by the name of Keisha Blaine, I think her name is, she's done extensive research on the subject. But my mom gave me an article and some information about this, and she was saying that Malcolm X's mother is a product of the liberated Africans, or what I read in a book one time were known as emancipados. All right. Now, these were slave ships that were sailing across the Atlantic Ocean after the British had abolished slavery in 1807. See, the British were like the police of the world at the time. And so as the police of the world and having the strongest military in the world, they kind of decided to dictate the terms in which who can trade and who couldn't trade. Now, the British, obviously, they tried to take some type of like supercilious moral high ground in claiming that they abolished slavery for moral reasons. But the reality would point to something different. Now, what ended up happening was this. After 1807, when the British had abolished the transatlantic slave trade, a lot of the Europeans who were close to the British had ended their slave trade as well. The United States abolished their transatlantic slave trade, and when I say transatlantic slave trade, I'm talking about slaves who are coming directly from the African continent and being imported into anywhere in the Americas. The United States abolished theirs in 1808. The French slowed theirs down, and the French still brought some over at certain times, but for the most part, they had abolished theirs as well. There were only two countries that really picked up the pace in importation of Africans straight from the African continent after 1807, 1808. Well, the United States did illegally a lot as well, but there were two countries that really did this a lot, and that was Cuba and Brazil. Now, as the Cubans and Brazilians continued to transport Africans into the Americas, they were doing it trying to avoid the British, all right? But the British were patrolling the high seas, trying to ensure that nobody was bringing over any enslaved Africans. But one of the things that the British would do by being the police of the world was whenever they would discover that the Cubans or the Brazilians were importing Africans to their countries from Africa, the British would come along and they would confiscate or condemn these ships and then confiscate the cargo consisting of the blacks, right? Now, what the British would do is they wouldn't take these Africans back home to where they came from. They would either take them back to their British colony in West Africa known as Sierra Leone, or they would take them to one of their own colonies in the British West Indies, mostly Trinidad, Guyana, and you would sometimes find them taking them back to places like Jamaica and Grenada as well. One of the places that they took some of their liberated Africans back to was Grenada. Now, they wouldn't, when these liberated Africans wouldn't be, they wouldn't really totally be liberated. They would basically become indentured servants in the new lands that they would arrive in. So the British are still exploiting the labor of these people, despite the fact that they're saying that they're abolishing slavery for moral reasons. They're still exploiting the labor, just like they continue to bring over Indian indentured servants into Trinidad and Guyana and these places. They took these liberated Africans and made many of these liberated Africans indentured servants, or some other form of exploited labor. Malcolm X's great-grandparents were these people. They were products of this. They had come over, I read somewhere, they said they had probably been born around the mid-19th century and had come over shortly thereafter. But as I looked at the transatlantic slave trade database for Grenada specifically, I only saw about 3 or 4 ships arriving in the years 1836 and 1837 into Grenada. The majority of the African captives that were heading into Grenada at this time were coming from Nigeria. For example, in 1836, you had 340 enslaved Africans, most likely to be on one ship, arriving from Sierra Leone. But in 1836, you also had 515 Africans coming from the Bight of Benin, Nigeria region. And then you also had 296 Africans coming from the Bight of Benin, Nigeria region as well in 1837. So the last slave ship that arrived in Grenada on record came from Nigeria. Now, the reason why I'm not sure if this is the ship that had Malcolm X's great-grandparents on it is because of the fact that the ages and the numbers, the chronology doesn't completely add up. If they'd come on this ship, let's just say as children, and they were born in the 1830s, this would make, in Louise Little, Malcolm X's mother was born in 1897. Louise Little's mother was 11 years old when she had his mother. So this would make Malcolm X's grandmother born in 1886, more or less, right? So the grandmother's born in 1886. That means that the parents of Malcolm's grandmother would have to be born probably 20 to 30, no more than 40-something years prior to that. And so that would bring us back to the 1840s. Now, unless Malcolm X's great-grandparents had a child at a really, really late date in their lives, like in their 50s, then it is possible that Malcolm X's great-grandparents from Nigeria came here came to Grenada on a slave ship as children in that slave ship that's listed in 1837 from Nigeria. But to make a long story short, whether they're on that slave ship in 1837 or if it's another one that's undocumented, the fact is this: Malcolm X's great-grandparents, who were Jupiter and Mary Jane Langdon. Jupiter and Mary Jane Langdon were Nigerian, right? Most likely Yoruba, because you had a lot of Yoruba people who were getting sold into slavery at this time throughout the diaspora because of the fact that the Oyo Empire, which consisted of Yoruba people, in the 1790s had collapsed. They no longer had a central military to defend the people of this empire. And so now, when the new slave trade of the 19th century was taking place, for Cuba and Brazil specifically, this is when you had a lot of Yoruba people getting spread throughout the diaspora. Now these Yoruba people ended up in large numbers in Cuba, they ended up in large numbers in Brazil, but they also ended up in large numbers in places like Jamaica and Grenada at the tail end of the transatlantic slave trade as liberated Africans. Okay, so Malcolm X, so the interesting thing is this: Jupiter and Mary Jane Langdon had their child, who was 11 years old, who was raped by the Scottish man by the name of Edward Norton when she was only 11 years old. But she was so young, she was a child herself. So the product of this rape, who was Malcolm X's mother, Louise Langdon, ends up being raised by her African grandparents.
There are more Africans here in Harlem than exist in any city on the African continent, because that's what you and I are, Africans. So we have to have a new approach, a new appraisal. And this new appraisal and new approach has to be in tune with the reality of the conditions that we are in after having been thoroughly brainwashed by this blue-eyed white man. Some of them have brown eyes.
Of Afro-American unity sees the only hope for the black man in America in a strong Africa, and the necessity of the Afro-American becoming inseparably linked with the overall program that's existing on the African continent.
Land is the basis of all independence.